Hi. All right, well, welcome to the East Side 1950s presentation. We got to hear some great 1950s music as you guys were coming in that I'm sure Mr. Tobias will talk about in a little bit. Alexis, Joy just came in, Ronnie. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and screen share. Oh my goodness, people. Peter. Stop coming in late. Okay. All right, so the 1950s. Go away. Go away, Matt. Just go away. Seriously, go away. Okay. Are you recording? I am. Good. All right. So here's little snippets of some photos kind of from the authentic 1950s, just to kind of give us a little feel in case you're not very familiar with it. All right, we're gonna start off with our trivia from the 1950s. Let's see, on average, gas cost 18 cents per gallon. By the end of the 50s, it had gone up to 25 cents. That's equivalent today of $1.90 per gallon or $2.16. So we're getting closer to the prices we see now for gas. On January 3rd, 1959, Alaska became the 49th state of the US. And then in August, Hawaii became the 50th. Charlie Brown, Snoopy, and the rest of the beloved Peanuts gang were introduced into the world in 1950. 1950 was an important decade with our civil rights in America. For a couple of examples, in 1954, the US Supreme Court ruled that the separate schools for Black and white was inherently unequal and unconstitutional in Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka. Then on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks famously refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white passenger. TV dinners were made and introduced. We had our first microwavable TV dinner. It consisted of turkey, stuffing, cornbread, potatoes. We got our first credit card, cha-ching. It was a Diners Club card. Disneyland opened in July 17th, 1955. People started to actually go faster in the 50s. Like running wise, a person got down to, I think what was record for less than 4 miles. New records were done for running. Alan Freed, a radio DJ in Cleveland, Ohio, started calling the emerging popular music of the time rock and roll. He is credited for coming up with said saying. The annual salary was $3,000 for the year. Can you imagine? $3,000 for a whole year's worth of work? That's equivalent with the dollar value to being about $34,000 to $43,000. US presidents actually got to the 2 terms. So before then, a president could run for many terms. A New Zealand beekeeper became the first person to climb Mount Everest. Car culture took off in the 1950s. The baby boomers peaked in 1957, meaning lots and lots of babies, and I believe Ronnie will be talking about that one. Beagles were the favorite companion of the canine doggy variety at the time. The office desk was invented and started to pop up into homes. I Love Lucy was the highest ranking show. And Dr. Seuss published his famous book in 1957 of Cat in the Hat. That's our important things happening in the 50s. Another big thing happened in the 50s, which was called art expressionism. So fun, kids, so fun. Oh, we have a chat from the Peanut Gallery. Oh, another couple of interesting facts here. Buddy Holly was married 1 year before he died in 1959. He was 22. Bye, Buddy Holly. It was awesome. So, art expressionism. refers to an art movement after World War II. The artists were generally considered abstract expressionism. With their new painting, it was more about feeling, it was more about the experience, the action of art. They got very far away from the traditional means of art, taking canvases actually off of, your easels, painting with things that weren't necessarily paintbrushes. It was all about just this abstract thinking and feeling and just complete action of doing. So these were considered rebel paintings of the 50s. It was a group that kind of was all friends, hung out in New York. It was the first time that America got fame and notoriety on the world stage for art. Most of the time it had been kind of like Paris focused and more European based art had been like the big thing. But now America, we've hit the scene with abstract expressionism. Yay. All right, so our painters we're gonna look at. Jackson Pollock, very famed, very renowned painter. I like his little quote up here, abstract painting is abstract. It confronts you. There is a reviewer a while back who wrote that my pictures didn't have a beginning and an end. He didn't mean it as a compliment, but it was. He enjoyed a lot of fame and notoriety in his works. There's like a little mock-up of him working. His artwork was huge, like actual size-wise. I have no good place to put this bar. So, go back, stop it. So this is one of Jackson Pollock's works. This one was done in 1952. It's enamel and aluminum paint on glass. This is like 7 feet wide and 15 feet tall. Little fun fact, he sometimes had to wear harnesses and smoked a lot while he arted, and cigarette butts would just fall into his artwork. So you can still see like his cigarette butts in there today. It's another piece, oil on canvas. This one's only 2 feet, only. Another one of his, Lavender Mist. You hear all the time, oh, I could have done that. Well, you didn't. He was the first one, so he gets the awards. William de Kooning. Flesh is the reason oil paint was invented. He took a lot of time arting the flesh and females was his big inspiration. This is one of his most famous series, Woman. It took him 2 years to complete this, from 1950 to 52. Another one of his, done in the 50s. It's titled Composition. Again, this is all about action and movement. Right? Also emerging on the scene was Mark Rothko, Ashton's just absolute favorite artist. So Rothko was very much known for his colors, his shapes, his balance, and his scale. Like Pollock, he painted very large. He also loved to paint rectangles, lots of rectangles. Right, so here we have, name Orange and Tan. Again, very big, 7 feet by 5 feet. And all of his are rectangles of different sizes and colors. Very big playing on scale and color. Right. Last we're going to look at is Clifford Steele, a very unique artist in a lot of ways with his abstract expressionism. This is one of his in 1950, right, with oil painting as the medium. Not lazy. There's another one of his. And again, one from 1957. So that is our wonderful art that was happening in the 50s. Towards the end of the 50s, you had all of our pop art start to emerge that we will look at in the 60s that is very different. But again, this was about the action of doing, the experience, you know, the freeness of it, right? Ways to kind of cope with the war that had been happening. So that's our art. Anybody have any thoughts, opinions you want to share? Right, Peter liked some of the last ones. All right. Ronnie or Tobias, who wants it next?
I can go next if you want to switch it up.
Sure.
Okay, so the 50s was a big decade for music. I'm going to try to speed through this, but if you have questions, you can ask them at the end. So leading up into the 50s, I want you guys to all think about one thing. We had however many thousands of years human beings have been on the planet. This was the first decade that actually formed the music industry, like officially. So that meant a lot of crazy things were going to happen because there was going to be mistakes that were going to be made. So there was really good stuff that happened and there was really bad stuff that happened. So I'm going to try my best to split it into these two categories, but let me get us to that point. So we talked about the technology, we talked about how records were invented, but they weren't really common until the 50s, like late 40s. So what we start to see is the idea of the record industry, or we call it like record labels. They start to show up. Now, before the 50s, this is a really important fact to know. There was like 5 to 10 record labels leading up into the 50s that had ever really like made any success for themselves. In the 50s, for like that 10-year span, almost 1,000 record labels form. So that goes to show like how much change was happening in that short amount of time. So what we start to see is, obviously with that, there's people who are trying to like maybe shift certain ways of doing stuff. We start to see the first really advent of people forming clear genres for music. Now, if you don't know what genre is, it's kind of like, you know, we look at the genres of country music and rock and roll, and those genres are becoming more and more clearly defined as the decade starts to happen. But we can't talk about the 50s without talking about the advent of rock and roll. But how the heck did rock and roll come about is actually really interesting. So basically what was happening, like because these genres were starting to form, we have these 3 main primary genres that were kind of leading into the decade. And I could say like, I won't talk about some of the artists that you wouldn't recognize, but obviously probably most of us would know the name Frank Sinatra, right? So think about Frank Sinatra being like the kind of music that brings us into the decade. And then I'm going to give some names that are what kind of bring us into these genres for the decade, so you can contrast them against Frank Sinatra. First would be rock and roll, and like the big name obviously would be Elvis Presley, right? The fun fact about Elvis is that Elvis made his first recording for $8 at one of these smaller record labels I was talking about for a gift to his mom. And then they saw that he had talent and they brought him back in, and they, you know, the rest is history. But the music that he got famous on, I'll talk about this in a second, is part of some of the bad stuff that was happening in the 50s, is that it wasn't even his music. In fact, it was made by people who never did have a chance at success because of their cultural difference or the color of their skin. So there was this kind of like, I guess I would try to simplify that statement by saying that music that was being recorded did not have a lot of clear line on who owned the music, because things were still in the kind of this like figuring it all out stage. And so there was music that was being written and maybe like somewhat recorded, if it even got to that point, by people who never got credit for that music. And that's a really like unfortunate thing that starts to take place, is that there's songs that maybe go and they like go on the charts and they don't do well in one category because they were done by an African-American person or something like that. And then maybe another record label sees the song for potential and then they put it into another category with a different genre, a different white artist, and they gain all this success, and the music charts, tops the chart. So it's a really weird imbalance that starts to happen. And I bring all this up because when I talked about all that technology and like leading into the 50s last week, it's really important that we understand why it happened, because it was so expensive and it was so limiting that people who had the money, they could really control. They had like the keys to the kingdom as to who was going to become popular and who wasn't, who was going to get a chance to put their music on the radio and who wasn't. So I'll go through some of these. The three genres that we really see in the 50s are going to be rock and roll. So Elvis, obviously, there's Chuck Berry, there's Buddy Holly, Jerry Lee Lewis. And this is like a category, I could talk about this later, but it will start to form and become something more specifically rock and roll, but also is country music. Now, a lot of you like sigh when I say country music, but country music back then and rock and roll were very, very similar. And so an artist like Johnny Cash would be fitting into the country music, but he was doing a lot of the same stuff that rock and roll was doing. And Roy Orbison, actually, he technically fits into the rock and roll category, but they kind of put him in both. So it's like these genre lines weren't clearly being defined quite yet. They were still evolving. And then lastly, this is the one that is kind of the crazy, is R&B. So R&B stands for rhythm and blues. And rhythm and blues was literally like a dedicated genre that record labels formed just to have people with dark skin. I mean, that's literally what it was there for. And so there was so much music that got like, well, because of the color of your skin, you're going to have to change your music to form into this genre. Otherwise, you can't put it out there. And then it would go into that genre. And then if the song like did okay or didn't do okay was irrelevant, sometimes those songs would then get taken by other artists because of the lack of ownership rights and that kind of stuff. And so they would get famous by other artists. And so that's kind of like the unfortunate part of the decade. That's kind of the main stuff. But definitely what we see is like with all of the record labels, the smaller labels formed, what you have to imagine is like, okay, if we had 5, obviously there's only so many places in the country you could go to record something. If you have 1,000, they weren't all at one time, but let's say we even have 500, that's so many more locations to have more diverse palette of music being recorded. So in the 50s, you have like all these little records that are going to get put out that some wouldn't see the light of day until much later, but then others are going to go into what we would see as jukeboxes, which is a huge part of the culture. So if you're not familiar with what a jukebox is, it's a little station that has records in it, and you would go and put in your quarter or whatever much it was going to cost, and you would choose the song, and the record would go and it would sit down and it would play that song. And so this is definitely where like I want to make this one big point before we're done, is that music becomes an actual expected part of our culture in the 50s. Before then, it was like, great, we can go to a dance hall, we can go see live music, maybe we can listen to it on the radio, but it wasn't expected as a part of your day-to-day. Whereas in the 50s, like going to the diner and playing the jukebox and having a radio in your car, and these things were like, music became woven into our world in a totally powerful way that would change the rest of what we would see as the future of music. So that's kind of, that sums it up for me, I think. I can take questions, I guess. Okay. Yeah, I don't see many questions, but a lot of comments. So
just a lot of side talk.
I think that's it.
So, you know, it's interesting. There's one of the reasons that we do these Thursday talks with Rebecca, Tobias, and I is that things do become so interwoven with the art and the music and what people were wearing. And so I actually just really quick, as Rebecca was talking about Jackson Pollock, a few years ago, I did a clothing collection, and it was based on famous works of art.
And one of the Jackson Pollock paintings that she showed, I actually recreated in a dress. And it's actually a 1950s style dress. So you'll see that silhouette. So I'm really quick going to share the image with you guys so you can see. This is from...
I was just looking for it.
I know. Yeah, it took me a minute to find it. It's been a while. So right here, you see this girl wearing, and you can kind of see behind her the Jackson Pollock. It's that really big one that Rebecca showed. And then I recreated it in a dress. I laid it out literally in my driveway, and I splattered paint and tried to create some of the texture that he did. And then last week when she talked about Frida Kahlo, this is my Frida dress. And so here's the, I don't know, Rebecca, what decade is Gustav Klimt?
I don't know.
Pre, right? Before this? Yeah. And this is my Van Gogh sunflowers.
Oh, but that's not right.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just thought like I would, show you guys that design and art and music all go together. But I do, whoopsies, come back here. I'm so non-techie, you guys, it's awful. Okay. Let me go back to my other screen so I can really quick go through the slideshow. And because I have a tendency to talk too long, I am actually setting myself a timer, or I will be here talking to you guys for the next half an hour. Okay. Nobody wants that. All right. 1950s. Woo woo. All right. So here we go. Last week in the 40s, everything really revolved around the war. What you could get, what you couldn't get, what you could do, what you couldn't do. And now people are ready to sort of get back to living and get back to traditional gender roles. So like the soldiers are coming back from the war and they don't want their wives working in factories and wearing, overall pants and uniforms. They want them wearing pretty dresses and jewelry and doing their hair. And so it was all about this return to femininity. And one of the things you'll notice is that they wanted women to have this type of body shape. Okay, so really itty bitty teeny tiny waist, bigger up top, big full skirts. The rationing wasn't happening anymore, and so women could wear longer skirts with really full and layers. And so you'll see there's some famous fashion icons from the 50s, including Barbie. And if you didn't have that type of body type, you could fake it with a girdle. Everyone wore girdles, all the women. And if you did not wear one, you were considered very unladylike. It was kind of scandalous. You weren't a nice girl if you didn't wear these hardcore undergarments. If you didn't have that body and there's no amount of girdling to achieve it, you might style yourself as sort of the anti-Barbie, and that was Audrey Hepburn. She was thin, kind of flat-chested. She did not have that curvy body type, but she became extremely famous. This is a still from a movie called Breakfast at Tiffany's, which I'm going to guess some of you have seen. 3 basic looks: that hourglass look, which was also called the new look, this long and tapered like our Audrey Hepburn, and then this was sort of more your average woman, kind of boxy cardigans and sweaters. Heavy eyebrows. The cat eye becomes very popular, and a deep dark red lip. So you'll see pictures of this. This style is coming back. And in fact, I think if you guys all look at Rebecca right now, she's kind of got that vibe going on. Look at these crazy hairdos. They women did not go around with their hair just kind of loose and flowy or up in a messy bun like I've got mine, or in ponytails. Every night they put their hair in curlers. Every night it was set and needed to be done. So two really famous designers I want to talk about: Christian Dior, and he made this new look, this silhouette, famous, but it wasn't really new, because from the 1850s in the Victorian era, this was that popular look: itty bitty, teeny tiny waist, big wide skirt bottom. Okay. So this is your kind of typical 1950s silhouette. But there was another very famous designer named Coco Chanel, and not only did she really hate Christian Dior, but she hated this look. She was also very famous. She made this matching suit and like suit jacket and skirt combo famous. In fact, both Christian Dior and Coco Chanel, they're like fashion houses. They're both dead now, but their fashion houses still put out spring and fall collections. Menswear, sorry, Riley, it is still boring this month, but when we get to the 60s and the 70s, it does get a little more exciting. Men wore these basic suits. The ties were longer. So last week, they wore their flashy ties. But by the 50s, it's very plain, long, skinny ties, hats, suits, blah. Oh my God, I'm already done after 5 minutes. Ah! Okay, I'm skipping forward. Look at this in the suburbs. Here you go. Look at these crazy outfits these men are wearing. They finally got to sort of relax a little bit out in the suburbs.
Those socks.
Yeah, right, but still with socks. Okay, really, really fast. I want to talk about what were teenagers wearing. You were either a nice teen, where you wore your poodle skirts, your pedal pushers, that's what those called, suits, the Letterman's jacket was a sweater before it became a jacket, or you were the naughty teen. You were a rebel, like James Dean. This is where the greasers came in, and most of you have probably seen Grease, where you've got that clash between the nice teens and the naughty teens. Elvis, we talked about him musically as well. He was a style icon in that he had that big pompadour, but in high school, he would wear eyeliner, and he would shop and wear things that he liked rather than what was trendy. And so he used to get bullied and beat up a lot by the jocks, which I didn't know until I was researching this. The hipsters of the 50s were called beatniks. They were into poetry. These were like the cool arty kids. They were like not into anything mainstream. They like went to coffee shops and listened to jazz and listened to poetry, man.
Deep. They were deep.
Super deep. So there you go. I only went a couple minutes over. Guys, I can talk for hours. Okay, so let's look back here.
Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
Is also very correct when he says that Jane Mansfield got famous for flashing her boobs. She would be like at a movie premiere and oops, accidentally wardrobe malfunction, but it wasn't an accident, y'all. Like, that wasn't an accident. And then she ended up becoming famous for being famous, just like some, famous people these days. The eyebrows were intense. Yes, Andrew. And yes, fashion does change a lot. However, you'll notice that about every 50, 60 years, a lot of those trends start to cycle back. So right now, the 90s,
yep,
you're going to see stuff from the 90s that are coming back.
So my husband had a comment while you were talking that he wonders if there's going to be a shift in fashion and a shift in things after this whole lockdown thing. Like we saw.
You know, that's a super great question because if you think about it, this is the first time that people are not really going out, right? So if a designer created an entirely new collection and you would assume that it would become trendy, nobody's going anywhere. People aren't shopping. So what does that do to the designs that just came out a few months ago? Will they just be bypassed? Will there be a delay in our trends? Man, who knows?
I've seen so many ads lately about like how to stay comfortable and look like the way you want to look. So it's like they're totally shifting from like don't do too much work for like making yourself look good for other people. Stay comfortable, but you could still look the way you want to look.
Yeah.
Boots are coming back.
Yeah, maybe it'll be like, really modern, trendy, like track suits and stuff like that. Who knows? Remember those juicy couture track suits that were like the velvety ones?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that kind of thing will come back.
One of the things I totally forgot to say, which is super important, I think it was aligned with what you were saying, Ronnie, is that also arts in general, but like obviously you have the rebellious like side of things. In music, clearly there was like rock and roll and other things. They were considered like rebellious fads, and they were gonna be ignored until they just passed away, and faded away. And so I think it's really interesting to see what that the wars and all of like the depression and like a lot of this like pent up stuff I talked about last week, it does turn into this like we want to express ourselves, so get out of the way. Like we want to do it our way and stop telling us how to do it. I think that pattern happen anytime that there's something that kind of is like substantially negative in our society. We the pendulum swings the other way, and we kind of say, let us express that as artists. We all come at different ways, maybe with it, some with music, some with fashion, some with art, but we all try to find a way to say something about it. You see these like incredible pieces of work being created out of those negative slumps that we get into.
Right. Dinah has a great thing, #renegades.
And I wonder too, with so many people, and I'd be curious to know what you guys think, with so many people being stuck at home, is that going to lead to an increase in creative output? Or because it's been so stressful and anxiety inducing, are people's artistic impulses being diminished by the lockdown, right? So will we see a huge explosion of art and creativity, or will we see a depression?
I think both. I think some people will rise from it, where others, at least from what I can tell from the arts, people are really using it as an outlet, or they're completely withdrawn in.
You're totally right, because I have a lot of friends right now who are artists that full-time make their living doing music, and some of them are responding with like, I'm staying off all social media, I don't want to be a part of anything right now. And then others are like putting out 2 records in a month because they finally have the time on their hands that they've been wanting to really dive deep into their music. So I think, yeah, you're probably right, we'll see both.
I have experienced a personal, like, complete diminishment in my creative impulses. Like I have had all this time that I could be really creative and working on things, but like almost can't force myself to do it. Are you being super creative, Rebecca?
I'm painting. Yeah. I went through a phase to where I wasn't feeling creative at all and was like, I can't even. And then I was just like, no, I need to like push myself, and I started pushing myself to art, and I'm coming up with some great stuff that I really love out of this. Pau had a really good comment a little while ago on the fashion side of this, what is going to come out of this, and what we saw even before lockdown was the trend in masks, and masks being part of that expression, right? And that's really kind of taking over with culture and like our fashion.
Yeah.
I thought a little bit about that too. Like, what if they made a gadget that ended up making face masks, like for keeping your like surgical face masks that end up doing something interesting instead of just being like for
Practicality.
walking out. Yeah, just for instead of just being for the practicality.
Well, it's been, especially like in Asia and in certain other countries, face masks have been a fashion statement, right, for a long time, and sort of a counterculture um, statement, right? It's never really caught on here that much, but like in Japan, a lot of people wear them as like matching their outfits and stuff.
I was seeing it more and more, even in our school, starting to see it more and more as a fashion thing before all this happened. So it'll be interesting see where that goes.
You guys think that somebody could do to make face masks popular? Like put a air flavoring fan in there or something so that it doesn't get really musty in there.
So that's the big doctors, with the big bird noses. The reason they had those big noses was that they would actually fill them up with flowers and herbs. So you would smell that instead of like the death around you, Peter. That's actually been a thing for a long time.
Speaking of, Riley was going to try making one of those plague doctor masks. How did that happen, friend? How'd that go? Did you get it done?
That never really ended up happening. I watched a couple of videos on it, and it all seemed like 20 plus hours of just hand sewing, and I didn't want to deal with that.
Addison, good job making masks. That's awesome.
Yeah, I was just typing. That's awesome. I've made about 200, and I never want to make another one again.
Alex, if you want to say something, just unmute yourself. I gave you power.
Yeah, everybody can unmute themselves if they want.
And then I take it away.
Yeah.
This is my first mask that I'm making.
What?
I'm making a mask. This is my first one.
Nice. Tobias, there's a question for you. Oh, also, by the way, Ronnie did not say what I wanted her to say. So in the 1950s, boom of babies born, hence the word boomer. So that is.
I talked about it last week.
Did we? No, I just want to reiterate, not a boomer.
Not a boomer.
Hey, I've heard that Generation Z people were, before the pandemic, supposed to be called Zoomers. So it kind of makes sense, right?
Zoomers versus the boomers was a thing before the pandemic really started. Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Brian. All right. Super, super good, you guys. I love how many people came. Just a reminder for my class, your 1950s sketch is due tomorrow. So you can look at the slideshow that's in Google Classroom and get some ideas. So please submit that in Google Classroom. Otherwise, I might lose it and give you a 0 by accident.
Oh, and since you're all here, I want to clarify one thing about my assignment that I've been asked a whole bunch, and I keep just like giving the same response via email, but since you can all hear it now, when you're looking for your songs from each decade, I don't insist that you love the songs. Like, I realize that it's not all going to be music that you fall in love with, but I do want you to pick songs that you are at least interested in, like the backstory of. So I want you to have some sort of understanding of what the song, I don't want you to go to YouTube, hit 1950s, and then pick the first one. do some like actual research about that song so that you understand why you're putting it in your playlist. Because if I come and ask you, I don't want you to just be like, well, that was the first one that came up. You know what I'm saying?
Can we do the first thing that comes up, but then learn about it and know what it means?
No, I would like you to at least have looked at, 5 to 10 songs before you pick your 1 to 3 so that you have something that you're actually like basing it on. As the decades go, the amount of music that is possibly like able to be researched is going to be exponentially more. So the 1950s, there's so much music compared to the 40s and so on. So each decade, there's going to be so much that I want you to at least have listened to some of it so that you understand what you're actually pulling from and not just go off of somebody else's list.
Also, if we are running over like we do and you have another meeting to get to, feel free to just like leave at the time that you need to leave. Okay, guys? Don't feel like you have to stay here because we go over. I know some of you have other meetings right after this. So it's okay.
Miss Rebecca,
Yes.
did you get the thing I said about my piece?
Yes, Tyler.
Working on it.
All right. Anybody have any questions as we wrap this up?
I do.
Go ahead.
The question that I put in the chat earlier that I think people might have just thought was chatter. Were ICs invented during the 50s, or did we get those later?
It
Wait,
was
what?
what?
ICs? What's an IC?
Integrated circuit.
Okay.
Oh, that's a question for another time, Peter. I think we'll get into that later in a different group.
Oh, my chest hurts.
All right. Make sure you're putting your art in Google Classrooms. That's the only way I will take it. And we will see you guys next.
Don't give me an incomplete for the thing. Capiche, Miss Rebecca?
Bye, everyone.
I said
Bye.
Only